structure today is more than 1,200 feet above sea level, so how could this place be the location of an island that once met the ocean? Well, notice the various areas of white coloration that you see not only from the air, but from satellite imagery as well. These white blemishes are indeed salt.
即係昔日有海嘅地方咧，變咗一個嘅山丘。呢個唔係天方夜譚嚟㗎，因為喺撒哈拉沙漠咧都揾到有鯨魚嘅骸骨啦，即係證明以前嗰度咧係有海嘅。又或者咧有一個更加勁嘅例子，譬如喜馬拉雅山上面揾到咩咧？就係一啲貝殼嘅化石。咁即係換句話說咧，喜馬拉雅山以前係一個海床嚟嘅，咁咪板塊移動嘅時候擠壓咗，成為一座高山。咁當然啦。Rickshaw structure 咧有可能係火山活動咧，就唔係板塊活動，以至到佢隆高咗咯。
You can even go there and taste it right off the ground yourself, as my journalist friend Josh Sigurdsson did, and what an insanely epic trip he had to this site. In fact, he almost died, and I encourage all of you to go and watch his video on BitChute. But something many people do not know is that this region has an abundance of salt at surface level. In fact, you can read articles about the salt caravans that exist in Mauritania today. This is something that is widely documented yet little known. This salt came from the ocean, and you can literally see it in the exact areas where cataclysmic flooding once flowed through here, as you can see from satellite imagery. And even the areas of the lowest elevation within the Richat are the areas with the most salt, making it even more evident that salt water once consumed and settled within this structure. And you'll also see it noticeably at the southern entrance, respectively. It's worth noting that the highly respected Randall Carlson himself has analyzed this site and stated that it is a location of cataclysmic water erosion. He actually went into detail about this on his own YouTube channel, and I highly recommend you check it out, and I'll leave a link in the description down below. But let me play a couple short clips so you can hear it directly from him.
And in fact, I'll show you in a minute, it looks like there was evidence for extreme floods over this whole landscape. You can see incised by erosion. This is obviously water erosion here.
And he goes on to make the comparison of the massive recessional cataracts found at Dry Falls in Washington State, which were caused by cataclysmic flooding at the end of the last ice age. Well, it turns out that the Richat itself has the same type of water erosion as well, as he points out here.
Which is very interesting. You see what actually looks like recessional cataracts.
Yeah.
So the stripping and exposure of this feature may have involved catastrophism.
Now, hold on to that thought, because he goes on to point out that you can even see the landmark water ripples created from immense levels of water flow all around the Richat, which matches the landmark ripples observed in the northwestern United States in the same exact region as the Dry Falls recessional cataracts as I just shared. The pictures you see here are at the Missoula floodplains in Washington State and Montana, which Randall Carlson was discussing. And those massive ripples are hundreds of feet wide and can only be appreciated from the air, as they are that big, which further illustrates the level of cataclysmic flooding this area once endured some 12,000 years ago. And real quick, just for frame of reference, compare the small ripples we've all seen at the beach. And in fact, just the other day, I had a great synchronicity while I was walking my dog along a canal and noticed the same small sand ripples at the bottom. So now listen to what Mr. Carlson shares with us about the Richat.
Look right here. You see the current ripples? Now there's sand between them, but if these are similar to the giant current ripples we see out in Washington and Montana, and notice the texture here, passing over the region out to sea, right here. And if we zoom in,
okay.
Yeah, so this is southwest of the actual structure. So what it appears to me is sometimes you had tremendous processes at work here. Oh yeah, look at this, beautiful. Oh man, there it is.
Wow.
There it is. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Intense.
Now, something that Randall makes no mention of is the existing salt found all around this area, including the images he shares on screen, as you can observe throughout this image in the area, all those white blemishes. We can even reference the nearby Tashit, Mauritania salt caravans I shared a few moments ago. All of those white blemishes are surface level salt, and I'd be very curious to hear what Randall Carlson's thoughts are on this important detail. Again, this is how you know the Richat was consumed by the ocean within the last 12,000 years by some unknown cataclysmic flooding event, because let's not forget that the latest scientific studies have proven that the Sahara Desert was a lush green tropical paradise up until around 11,600 or so years ago, which is when it started to become the vast desert we all know today. And the sands of the Sahara are known to have come from the ocean after this transition to the desert happened, and the fact that the sand has salt on top of it is how you know that the ocean flooded over this region far more recently than most realize. You see, most have assumed that the last time North Africa was under the ocean was between 50 and 66 million years ago. And that was the time of the Trans-Saharan Seaway. But notice that this seaway does not annotate it going over the area of the Richat structure. Rather, it goes south. Yet, clearly, the same landmark evidence of cataclysmic flooding did flow over the Richat, which is evident, and also confirmed by experts such as Carlson himself, which indicates that something else, something separate, happened over this area far more recently. And the fact that these landmark water ripples still exist in the same fashion as the identical ripples in Washington state only further adds to the corresponding evidence that something happened over the Richat at that same period of time. And these features of water erosion would have surely been eroded long ago, especially when we consider that the Sahara is confirmed to transition back and forth from lush green jungle to desert every 20,000 years. And that's according to a study by MIT, by the way. But that by itself would constantly be changing the surface of this region. I mean, think about that. With all the constant changes we now know that the Sahara endures, to even suggest that the area around the Richat hasn't changed in the last 50 to 66 million years ago is basically like saying that nothing has changed here since back of the time of the dinosaurs, which of course would make no sense, and to be fair, nobody is actually suggesting that directly. However, that would have to be the case if what they were saying were correct, and it obviously isn't. There's obviously more to the story, as clearly something happened to North Africa far more recently. And when we discuss cataclysmic flooding 11,600 years ago, let's compare that to the time frame to other separate declassified CIA documents that I also discussed in a different video a couple years ago. There's a book called The Adam and Eve Story, which was discussed in a secret CIA meeting some 50 years ago, and the book itself was not classified, as some have thought, but the reason why this book was discussed in a CIA meeting in the first place is still classified. But in that book, the author, Chan Thomas, described events that happen routinely on Earth that cause biblical levels of ocean flooding over entire continents. And look at the date on that. Identical to the 11,600 year date I've just been discussing, and keep in mind this book was written 50 plus years ago, so where it says 11,550 years ago is actually the same date today. But I mean, come on, what are the odds of that? The same date described continental flooding, and here we have the Sahara Desert that looks like it was obliterated by a continental-sized flood. And if you haven't watched my video on that, go check it out, as it's becoming increasingly clear that there is a connection to what we're seeing at the Richat and North Africa. And that's not all that's to be said about the 11,600 year date, as it is the same exact date that Atlantis was said to have been destroyed, as Solon went to Egypt in 600 BC and was told that Atlantis had been destroyed precisely 9,000 years earlier. Well, 600 BC is 2,600 years ago from today, and then add the 9,000 years on top of it, and it equates to precisely 11,600 years ago. That is far too precise to be a coincidence, and if you ask me, it is legitimate evidence that Atlantis actually existed. But if that's not overwhelming enough, the 11,600 year date is also the same exact timing of the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe that occurred 11,600 years ago and instigated what is referred to as Meltwater Pulse 1b. There was a sudden and rapid rise in global sea levels at the end of the last ice age, and again, 11,600 years ago. All of the dots connect here, and it's apparent for all who have eyes to see. something really bad happened on Earth at that period of time, and it's weird that this isn't discussed in more headline news. But now going back to the discussion of the wrist shot being the location of Atlantis, many will say that since it's currently more than 1,200 feet above sea level and that it's not an island and that there are no remnants of destroyed structures here, how could it possibly be the location of Atlantis? Well, this is actually very easy to explain, and it's apparent that the region of Northwest Africa has lifted. The existing salt is there. The ocean did indeed go over it. It's funny how people will claim that the wrist shot could not have been at sea level, yet they never mention the existing salt all around the area, including within the wrist shot. But when we consider that the whole region is known for its volcanic activity, including the various island chains off the west coast of Africa, and the massive Atlas mountain chain located north of the wrist shot, and the very fact that the wrist shot structure itself is considered to be the result of repeated volcanic activity, as it was said to have been lifted and collapsed multiple times over, thus creating the ring structure we see today. It's more than appropriate to assume that the surrounding area has subsequently been lifted as well, because that's exactly what volcanic activity does. It lifts the ground in the surrounding area, and most people understand this, but to paint you a picture of what's possible, let's just consider the extraordinary case of the Pericutin volcano in Mexico. On February 20th, 1943, a volcano suddenly started to develop on a farmer's field, and the cone rose to nearly 1,500 feet or 450 meters from its base in the very first year. So the fact that the wrist shot is less than 1,300 feet above sea level is completely feasible to have been lifted over the course of some 12,000 years, even when we consider the lower global sea levels at that time. Again, I don't know what happened to North Africa 11 to 12,000 years ago, nor do I know what happened there in the 10,000 years since. But the very fact that the sand is there and the salt is on top of it says it all. But people will say, if this was indeed the location of Atlantis, then where are the artifacts and remnants of destroyed buildings? Well, considering that the massive flooding stripped away the bedrock itself, that means that everything that would have been built above it would have been swept away along with that bedrock that once sat on top of.